Hello and welcome to this Mikhail Botvinnik game review. I'm going to give it away. Mikhail Botvinnik wins this game, but let's see how he did it and what we can learn from it. Now, this game took place in 1961. I believe it was in Moscow. Basically, Mikhail Tal in 1960 played against Botvinnik and won the World Chess Championship. And then they had a rematch in 1961, which Botvinnik came back and won. And we're going to see how he did that. Tal was known as one of the greatest attacking players in chess history. And Botvinnik knew that, so he decided to really figure out what openings would be good to play against Tal that were more strategic and less tactical. And one of those is the Caro-Kann defense. So the game begins with e4 by Tal, who's an attacker. So he wants to play e4, and this pawn move usually tends to open things up more depending on how the opponent plays. So Botvinnik, trying to keep things more strategic and calm, plays the Caro-Kann, which is known to be a solid, safer defense. Botvinnik grabs the center, and then in Caro-Kann fashion, you play d5, the reason that you push to c6 to cover this d5 push. So what does what does Tal do against Botvinnik here? He pushes forward, the advanced variation. Now this grabs more space in the center. The center is kind of closed for the moment, but white has more space, and the pawns are aimed at the king side here. So generally you want to just throw everything over here towards the king side where your pawns are pointing. And now we have this move. Bishop to f5, probably the most common move. You plan to push this pawn forward and you don't want to lock your bishop in behind these pawns. So now h4 is played. And this could be the threat of a trap. If you push this forward and then you go back, well, you could attack, and if the bishop goes here, well, then you could try and trap that bishop. So what does Botvinnik do? He plays this move. An escape hatch is created for that bishop where it could drop back here if it needs to. So the game continues with Tal pushing forward anyway, gaining space on the king side because, like I said, his central pawns are pointed in that direction, and that usually means you're going to have more space on that side of the board because of this e5 pawn. And why not throw these pawns forward, start storming the king side early, especially if you're a great attacker like Mikhail Tal was. Okay. Interesting choice. He drops back this way. Now, of course, if he goes here, it'll block his own pawn in. But maybe he didn't want to go back to here because, if this pushes forward and pawns are exchanged, the bishop would be pinned to that rook. So the game can, and let's see if that was the best move according to the computer. Here, they actually recommend bishop to e4, but you could push here, and then the only place available would be to go back to h7, and like I said, maybe the bishop could end up pinned to the rook there by white's rook. Okay, moving on. We have the bishop that had dropped back to d7. Tal pushes a pawn forward and solidifies his central pawn structure, reinforces this base of the chain, and now there's a new base of the pawn chain here, because generally when you have a pawn chain, you can attack it from the base of the chain, which is often one of the best ways to do it. And now that base is all the way down here at b2, where it's a little harder to go after. or you could attack the top of the pawn chain, but that would just weaken his king side. So the game continues with the thematic push here. You push this pawn up to c5. If it's captured, well, then you've doubled pawns. This advanced pawn is a little bit weaker. Let's see what Tall does. He ignores that in favor of development. Fianchettoing his bishop, lining it up on this unprotected pawn, as well as the other one, and aim down here towards the bishop. So now, most likely, this could be played, although another move recommended is h5, counterattacking over here, because if the central pawn is captured, well, then you could capture over here with an attack on the queen. But the safer move is played by Botvinnik. He just plays e6. Now he has this bad bishop blocked in by his own pawns. All right, a developing move, the first mistake of the game played by Tall. And let's see if we can figure out why this move is bad. Apparently h5 is recommended to go ahead and push that pawn, gain more space on the king side. And a missed opportunity by Botvinnik. Apparently pushing h5 with your pawn is better, gaining space over here. And I mean, it would basically force Tall to either capture or push forward. All right, the bishop move is made, an inaccuracy, a missed opportunity. So now we have h5 once again being the best move maybe, or bishop to e3 just developing in the center there. Tall decides to go with something else, immediately attacking this bishop. But the knight is on the rim of the board. And, the old saying, the knight on the rim is dim, because it doesn't have as much activity over there, or scope on the edge of the board. It can't move to as many squares. So bishop takes e2 is the best move. And that was probably what Botvinnik was aiming for, to get rid of his bad bishop. So instead, the h5 move is recommended. But we have this move being played, capturing, and then after recapture, that did help develop the queen. But now we have a knight left on the edge of the board. The bad bishop has been gotten rid of. What will Botvinnik play now? He captures towards the center, and then after recapture, we have capture of the other bishop. So this is quite interesting. Mikhail Botvinnik gets rid of both of his bishops for Tall's knights. But after this recapture, Tall is left with these weak, isolated double pawns, rook pawns also. And then there's also this possibility of check and then grabbing the pawn if the bishop is developed and blocks. So what will Tall do here? Well, first, Botvinnik just develops a knight. Now we have, because the knight was attacking this pawn, it's defended by the bishop. And the queen move with check here. Perhaps getting ready to grab that pawn. The knight prefers knight at g to e7, just continuing development of the knight, getting ready to castle maybe to the king side, but these pawns are already storming forward, and that could make it easier to crack open the king side if Botvinnik castles over there. So we have Tall sliding his king to the side, maybe wanting to keep this rook lined up on the unprotected rook on h8 in case things open up. All right, development of the other knight, and now the rook attacks this unprotected b pawn. What does Botvinnik do? He just slides his rook over defending, but that was an inaccuracy. apparently, what? Huh. Queen to c3 would have been better, with a threat of developing here, maybe, and attacking the queen. So a bishop move, which is another mistake by Tal. Now, it was known that Tal, the greatest attacker, or one of the greatest attackers of all time, he did have reportedly health issues during this rematch for the World Championship, and they think that affected his play. But it couldn't help that, or it probably helped that Botvinnik played these solid, safer openings to try and neutralize the crazy attacks that Tal normally had. So we noticed he's gotten rid of the knights, and knights sometimes make it easier to go for a win in an endgame. If you have bishops, especially opposite colored bishops, that can be more drawish. And also the center is closed up here, so these bishops don't have as much scope at the moment. All right, so better would have been what? Queen to d3, apparently. Okay, so now the queen moves up, once again not grabbing that pawn, but also aiming here at d4 along with the knight. So the game continues with defense, a defensive move. Botvinnik just grabs Tal's unprotected pawn here, going ahead in material, but that's an inaccuracy. Apparently knight to a5 would have been better, maybe with thoughts of bringing the knight to this outpost, bringing the other knight forward. So the game continues with the king seeking safety here. Maybe, it says that king to g2 is not the greatest move, that king to g1 would have been better. But g2 does connect the rooks, where they can work in tandem. The queen drops back here, offering a queen trade. Interesting. So another tactic, trying to get those queens off the board, or I should say a strategy, trying to get the queens off the board to neutralize the attacking possibilities. If Tal has a queen on the board, there's still opportunity for things to go wrong and crazy attacks to come out of it. So Tal decides to go ahead and take, which is the best move, doubling the pawns. It does open this rook up. So now we have pawn finally pushing forward, which is an excellent move, but apparently rook to b1 would have been better, immediately putting the question to the rook. Now, of course, the rook could have moved up here, perhaps. And then if it's captured, it would correct the doubled pawns. So king moving to the center. Finally, rook to b1 is played. And that move that I mentioned is played now. You push the rook forward because now if they're exchanged, you just repair your messed up pawns. And the king, and remember, it's important to activate those kings in the endgame. As more pieces come off the board, the king is more valuable because with a limited number of pieces, the kings really play a part in the endgame. All right, knight jumps forward, preparing that maneuver of coming over, maybe bringing the other knight up. So we have a capture, capture. Pawn presses forward, the best move, maybe trying to get ready to trade off pawns, because remember, if you're behind in material, you want to try and trade pawns off. Whereas Botvinnik, ahead of pawn, he wants to try and trade pieces off. So he's probably going to bring his knight over here attacking the bishop at some point, which he does now. Bishop retreats back, and this is a good strategy where that bishop is covering all these squares that the knight could possibly go to, limiting the scope of that knight. So the other knight jumps forward. Now we have this pawn under attack. So the rook defends, and the game continues with Botvinnik throwing his pawn, or excuse me, his knight forward, attacking this unprotected pawn. So the knight steps forward, but it looks like, is there an opportunity to pile up here on this? I don't know, because then the rook could maybe try and step up and guard. Let's see what happens. Okay, the bishop is under attack here immediately. So that is ignored in favor of a counterattack. Capture, capture, and Botvinnik is doing what he should. Just trading pieces off. And now he can go after the extra pawn, but he decides not to. He fixes that pawn. I guess now if the pawn moves forward and it's captured, it would leave doubled isolated pawns on the A file. But instead, we have defensive move being played. And that's a mistake. Apparently, rook to F1 would have been better. Maybe trying to exchange here and bring the rook down with a fork, a check, forking the king and this pawn. Instead, the king moves over to prevent that possibility, perhaps, and also to get out of the line of fire if there's an exchange and the bishop would be lined up on the king. All right. What next? And it says that knight to d2 would have been better, bringing the knight forward. But in the game, we have the king coming forward. Rook grabs the open file. And pawns are trying to be exchanged here by Tall. So after capture, king captures. Now what? Pawn captures and bishop captures. Well, the rook steps forward here. What does this move do? Well, it guards this pawn, I guess. It prevents this pawn from coming forward, the king from coming forward. It prevents the other H pawn from moving. So it does a lot to restrict Tall's pieces in the endgame. And the king drops back, the best move, perhaps preventing the knight from harassing his bishop. The rook sidesteps, attacking this unprotected pawn, but an inaccuracy according to the computer. They prefer knight to a5, dropping back here, and then what? Maybe coming over and targeting this pawn, perhaps? Bishop drops back to defend. The rook moves back to the open C file, but then what? We have this pin, but it's not too dangerous of a pin. And now, maybe this was an inaccuracy. Is it possible to just take this pawn? With a discovered attack here? Oh no, because then the rook could swing over and pin that knight to the king. So the other option is to move here and trade rooks off or do nothing. So let's see what happens. He ignores all of that, attacks in the center, and a blunder here. The first blunder of the game, rook to g1 would have kept the game even, bringing the rook over, threatening to capture with a check. So now we have capture, capture, and now what? The move is played. Now it is a brilliant move. Now that that pawn can no longer capture this knight. We have a discovered attack. So what happens if the pin is tried to be played here? We'll have to take a look at that. What happened in the actual game? This move was played. But let's see what would happen if that move were played. Well, the computer doesn't like that. I mean, it looks like it's pinned here. So you have king to f6, but if the rook would take the knight now, protected by the king, you have this move. Attacking the king and driving it away from the defense. And then Black's king would be able to recapture, keeping material even. All right. So, in the game, after this brilliant move by Botvinnik, we continue with an attack on the unprotected pawn. So the king just steps forward to defend. Bishop adds to the attack. And now the rook defends. So this apparently is where Tal resigned, as he is down 2 pawns. So not only is there a potential for a passed pawn over here on the queen side, there's also this passed pawn in the center. So down 2 pawns, at this point, Tal resigns. How could the game go? Even the computer says that Botvinnik is just about winning here. They recommend, looks like the best move, king to f5, then what? A5 to get these passed pawns moving, bishop to b1. Oh, that's an interesting choice. b1, and now what? a4 is recommended, which fixes this pawn on the dark squares, where maybe at that point you could try and go after it, and the bishop won't be able to protect it, only the rook. I'll play it out a few more moves, what the computer recommends. That way you can get an idea of how things might have gone. They recommend this move once again. I guess that means white doesn't really have many options. And now knight to c4, going after the pawn. King up to g6. Okay, that's an interesting move, trying to get a passed pawn over here. But now, knight to e3 check. Oh, sorry, that was wrong. That's e5. Let me go back. Knight to e3, defending the pawn with the knight and attacking the rook. So a counterattack would be recommended. Now the pawn is defended over here. But then you have king up to e5, bishop to what? f3 maybe? And knight to f5 defends the pawn here. So what? Bishop to g4 is next, targeting that knight. Rook to c6 check would push the king back to g5. And then what next? Knight over to h6, targeting the bishop. But anyway, some type of play. The game would have taken a while longer, but perhaps Tal, as I mentioned, his health wasn't the best in this rematch. So he probably felt that it would be a losing game anyway against the brilliance of Botvinnik. So he resigned. And if we take a quick look at the game review, it states that Botvinnik played with 92.1% accuracy versus 87.8% by Tal. And he pretty much gained a small advantage, kept that advantage, and grew it until the point here where the game was almost one move, it was even again. But then a blunder was made that was losing, and after that Botvinnik won. So Botvinnik had one brilliant move and 4 great moves. Tal just had 1 great move. The mistakes, 5 by Tal and only 2 by Botvinnik. They each had 1 missed opportunity and the 1 big blunder by Tal. So it looks like Tal played at a 2450 level versus 2550 by Botvinnik. And both of these players were probably, 2600 level players or higher at the time. So, sometimes you have an off day. All right, feel free to leave comments, especially if you have any requests on what type of videos you'd like to see in the future. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.